In the darkest corners of history, there are families whose legacies are not built on fortune or fame, but on whispers, shadows, and the kind of silence that only horror can demand. Hidden behind grand estates and locked cellar doors, these families carried out acts that were never meant to be spoken of, rituals and experiments that blurred the line between science and madness. One such name etched in secrecy is the Dunleith family, an aristocratic bloodline that turned their wealth into tools of terror, their home into a laboratory, and human lives into nothing more than disposable subjects. The Dunleith estate was not simply a home, nor was it merely a reflection of the wealth the family had accumulated over generations. It was a fortress of secrecy, a sprawling mansion surrounded by forests so thick and roads so twisted that few outsiders ever arrived uninvited. The architecture itself told two different stories. Above ground, towering stone walls, grand columns and windows with heavy drapes gave the impression of aristocratic elegance, the kind one might expect from a family with ties to education and nobility. Yet beneath the polished exterior, hidden doors, concealed staircases and subterranean corridors stretched into a labyrinth of shadow. These underground chambers, designed with more precision than any ballroom or gallery, were the true heart of the Dunleith legacy. Unlike the rest of the estate, they were built not for comfort or beauty, but for concealment, isolation, and control. Every brick seemed to hold a whisper of fear, every iron lock a barrier between the world above and the horrors below. Stories spread among the villagers in nearby towns of strange deliveries to the estate under the cover of night. Heavy crates, iron cages and barrels sealed so tightly that no one could imagine their contents were meant for ordinary use. Drivers spoke in hushed tones of unloading materials near hidden entrances, where servants with hollow eyes and pale faces would quickly whisk them away into the darkness of the mansion's bowels. Few dared to ask questions, for the Dunleith name carried both power and dread, and those who grew too curious often found themselves gone without explanation. Rumors took root that the estate itself was cursed, that the very land surrounding it drank in screams and suffering, and that those who ventured too close after dusk risked being swallowed whole by its shadows. Visitors who had the rare privilege of entering the grand halls noticed a peculiar atmosphere, as though beauty had been layered like a mask over something rotten. The chandeliers gleamed, the rugs were woven with intricate designs, the portraits of long-dead ancestors stared with stern pride. Yet beneath it all lingered a stifling weight, an oppressive silence that seemed too deliberate, too rehearsed. Some whispered that the walls were thicker than necessary, that every floorboard was designed to muffle sound, to keep what happened in the lower levels from drifting upward to polite ears. It was a house that seemed built to deceive, offering guests the illusion of nobility while concealing an empire of suffering in the shadows below. The underground chambers were said to have been constructed in phases, beginning with a single cellar in the earliest days of the family's wealth. Over generations, new wings were added, narrow tunnels branching into larger rooms, vaults reinforced with steel, and halls lined with hooks and chains. The deeper one went, the less the design resembled a cellar, and the more it mirrored a prison. Rooms were designed not for storage but for captivity, with barred doors, iron restraints, and walls stained with marks of desperate resistance. Some chambers were curiously sterile, with polished stone tables and drains carved into the floor, as if crafted for surgical procedures rather than confinement. Others were chaotic, with the remnants of past experiments, broken tools, scorched walls, and strange symbols etched into the stone. Accounts told of a central chamber, deeper and colder than the rest, where the family gathered for their most ambitious trials. This room, unlike the others, was adorned with symbols of alchemy and the occult, carved not merely for decoration but with intention, as though the Dunleiths believed their work was guided by forces beyond the ordinary. It was here, whispered the stories, that the line between science and ritual blurred, where the tools of physicians shared space with the artifacts of the forbidden. The estate became less a home and more a monument to madness, each chamber dedicated to breaking the boundaries of human endurance, each passageway leading further from the world of reason. The people who worked within the estate were bound to silence, yet their silence spoke louder than words. Servants walked with eyes cast down, refusing to meet the gaze of outsiders. They carried themselves with the stiffness of those who lived under constant surveillance, and their faces bore expressions that suggested knowledge of things they dared not speak aloud. Children of the servants were often sent away before they came of age, as if to shield them from the horrors buried in the estate's foundations. or perhaps to prevent them from asking questions their parents could not answer. It was not uncommon for entire families employed at the mansion to disappear, their absence explained away with vague excuses of relocation or illness. Yet the timing was always suspect, often coinciding with periods when strange lights were seen flickering in the woods or unearthly sounds drifted across the valley at night. The estate itself seemed to absorb and exude unease. Travelers passing along distant roads often claimed they felt watched, even from miles away, as though the looming structure cast an unseen presence that stretched beyond its walls. Some recounted seeing smoke rise from chimneys long after midnight, though no warmth came from its fires, only a strange, acrid odor that lingered in the air. Others swore that screams echoed faintly on the wind, carried over the hills, but always silenced before they could be traced to their source. Local clergy warned against venturing too near, calling the place an abomination that no holy blessing could cleanse. The Dunleiths themselves seemed to take pride in their estate's isolation. Invitations to gatherings were rare, and when they did open their doors to select guests, those events were carefully orchestrated to keep visitors confined to specific rooms, never allowed to wander freely. Guests were plied with food, drink, and conversation, distracted with displays of wealth, while the true heart of the estate, the underground sanctum where lives were destroyed, remained unseen. To the outside world, the mansion stood as a beacon of intellectual pursuit and refined living. To those who knew better, it was a tomb without graves, a place where walls were soaked in suffering, and no one who descended below its polished floors was ever meant to emerge whole again. The Dunleith family prided themselves on their lineage of intellectual pursuit, but unlike other aristocratic houses that poured their resources into literature, philosophy, or architecture, their obsession was rooted in the sciences twisted toward darker ends. They were well educated in medicine, anatomy, and the alchemical arts, with many members traveling across Europe to study under prominent physicians, scholars, and even those whispered to be dabblers in forbidden knowledge. Yet instead of returning with cures or innovations that would bring light to humanity, the Dunleiths perverted what they had learned, reshaping it into tools of torment and experimentation that served their own cruel fascination. The family believed that true progress could only be achieved by surpassing natural boundaries, and to them, this meant pushing the limits of human suffering, dissecting both body and mind until every secret was laid bare. From their earliest documented history, the Dunleiths displayed a tendency to blur the lines between healer and destroyer. Records indicate that the family patriarch in the 17th century was known for his anatomical studies, acquiring cadavers not only from criminals and the impoverished dead, but also through means that were never fully explained. Stories circulated that he purchased bodies from grave robbers or created circumstances where death conveniently arrived to those who crossed his path. His journals, fragments of which were rumored to have survived, spoke not of healing disease but of cataloguing how the human body broke under certain stresses, how organs failed when subjected to prolonged deprivation, and how consciousness flickered at the edge of unbearable agony. These early notes laid the foundation for the family's generational obsession with experimentation, passed down as both duty and inheritance. Later generations took these practices further, disguising them beneath the veneer of scientific exploration. They immersed themselves in alchemy, a field already steeped in secrecy and mysticism, but where most alchemists sought transformation of metals or spiritual enlightenment, the Dunleiths twisted it into a justification for experimenting on human flesh. They sought to merge the clinical precision of medicine with the transcendental promises of alchemy, believing that within the suffering of their subjects lay the key to transformation, longevity, and perhaps even immortality. Their laboratories were filled with glass vials of strange powders, liquids of unnatural hues, and instruments sharpened not for surgery, but for dissection, tearing, and alteration. Some claimed that they sought to create new life forms, splicing parts of one body to another in grotesque parodies of creation. Others whispered that their goal was to strip away mortality itself, testing concoctions of mercury, arsenic, and rare herbs on captives to observe whether the body could resist decay or endure beyond its natural span. Education became the weapon that masked their cruelty. Members of the Dunleith line frequently enrolled in universities under the guise of pursuing knowledge, collecting degrees and accolades that lent them a false legitimacy. They published carefully selected works on anatomy and medicinal theory, enough to position themselves as authorities among peers but never revealing the darker half of their research that occurred within the estate. This created an aura of credibility that insulated them from suspicion, for who would doubt a family whose sons and daughters held titles of scholars and physicians? Behind this facade, they returned home with knowledge that was put to work not in curing disease or bettering mankind, but in turning their estate into a theatre of atrocity. The family's twisted obsession with science was not fueled solely by curiosity, but by an ideology that considered human beings as mere vessels, tools for discovery, and expendable resources. They viewed their subjects not as people, but as experiments waiting to be unraveled. The cries of anguish that echoed through the underground chambers were not interpreted as suffering, but as data, every scream a measure, every convulsion a result to be noted in meticulous journals. They treated agony as evidence, blood as a formula, and death as an inevitable conclusion that offered insight into the next trial. Each failed experiment was not considered failure at all, but progress toward their ultimate ambition, whatever grotesque end they sought. What made the Dunleiths' practices all the more disturbing was the systematic nature of their obsession. This was not the work of a single deranged individual, but a tradition maintained across generations. Fathers taught sons, mothers taught daughters, each ensuring that the knowledge of how to break and unravel the human body was passed on without interruption. The younger heirs were initiated into these practices not through theory but through direct observation, watching as the suffering of others was transformed into lessons, as the chambers beneath their home became classrooms where textbooks were replaced with bleeding subjects strapped to stone tables. In this way, the family ensured that their obsession was not fleeting but deeply rooted, carried forward with cold precision by each successive heir. In their private writings, members of the family often justified their actions through grandiose reasoning, claiming that the sacrifices of a few could lead to enlightenment for the many, though their discoveries were never shared beyond their bloodline. They spoke of the human body as a machine to be taken apart and rebuilt, as though pain were merely a mechanical response rather than a cry of the soul. They convinced themselves that they were pioneers standing on the edge of forbidden frontiers, unafraid to go where others hesitated. This self-deception allowed them to persist without remorse, to see themselves as seekers of truth rather than architects of horror. Their obsession with science twisted into a mania that consumed their lives, isolating them from the outside world. They were rarely seen in social circles except when necessary, and even then, their presence carried an unsettling air. Observers noted their pallor, their sleepless eyes, and the peculiar way they spoke in clinical terms about life and death, as though emotions were foreign to them. They existed in a world of dissection and formula, incapable of empathy, their identities reduced to the pursuit of knowledge at any cost. Within the walls of the Dunleith estate, they cultivated a philosophy that no one outside their bloodline could understand or accept, a philosophy that turned human suffering into a currency with which they hoped to purchase secrets that nature itself had hidden. The subjects of the Dunleith family's experiments were not chosen at random, though to the outside world it appeared that disappearances struck without pattern. Those who vanished were often among the most vulnerable: servants employed within the estate, orphans plucked from surrounding villages, and drifters who wandered too close to the property at night. Over time, even distant relatives, those who carried the Dunleith blood but had no claim to wealth or inheritance, began to disappear. Their absence explained away with forged letters, sudden illnesses, or fabricated travels abroad. In reality, they were being ushered into the depths of the estate, where their lives became raw material for the family's insatiable pursuit of knowledge. Servants were often the first to vanish, their presence too easily dismissed by the aristocratic world outside. Those who served in the Dunleith household lived under constant fear, knowing that at any moment a summons to the lower chambers could be their final duty. Some were chosen for their physical attributes, others for their youth or endurance, and still others simply because they had witnessed too much. The silence among the servants was not loyalty, but terror, for speaking of what occurred in the mansion's depths was a death sentence. A whispered warning between workers, a glance exchanged when a cart carried strange tools into the cellar, was the closest anyone dared come to acknowledgement. Families of servants who vanished were often offered small sums of money and instructed to leave the estate quietly, but in some cases, entire households disappeared in a single night, absorbed into the black maw of the Dunleith experiments. Beyond their own staff, the Dunleiths sought out orphans and the destitute, individuals no one would miss. They manipulated local institutions, making charitable donations to orphanages and hospitals that gave them access to vulnerable children under the guise of offering them opportunities. Promises of education, work, or care lured many into the estate willingly, unaware that their benefactors saw them only as subjects for pain and dissection. These children and the impoverished poor became test cases for strange concoctions, subjected to poisons and elixirs, surgeries performed without anesthesia, and exposure to conditions designed to push the human body past its breaking point. Villagers who asked after missing children were silenced with lies, bribery, or the unspoken threat of becoming the next experiment themselves. Even those of Dunleith blood were not spared. Cousins, illegitimate offspring, or relatives considered unfit to represent the family publicly were quietly invited to stay at the estate, only to vanish within its halls. These disappearances were cloaked in polite explanations: an untimely illness, a sudden decision to travel abroad, or in some cases, the vague suggestion of madness that justified their confinement. In truth, their blood made them especially valuable, for the family often believed that their own flesh carried secrets that could only be unlocked through invasive study. The notion that kinship offered protection was an illusion. In the Dunleith philosophy, lineage was not a shield but a resource to be consumed. The experiments themselves were brutal in both design and intent. Subjects were deprived of sleep, food, or light for extended periods while their reactions were meticulously recorded. Others were exposed to chemical concoctions that burned through their veins, leaving their bodies twisted in agony as the Dunleiths scribbled notes with clinical detachment. Some were bound to tables and subjected to surgical procedures without the mercy of painkillers, their organs probed, removed, or replaced with substances meant to test theories of endurance and transformation. It was said that some chambers echoed with voices begging for release, voices that eventually fell silent and were replaced by the next in an endless cycle of torment. One particularly disturbing practice was the family's fixation on endurance. They sought to measure how long a body could survive without air, without nourishment, or under extreme stress, creating elaborate devices to stretch the limits of human resilience. These contraptions were coldly mechanical, designed with precision to control the exact amount of deprivation or suffering inflicted. To the Dunleiths, each life was nothing more than a set of data points, each death a necessary step toward some elusive discovery. They were not content with observing suffering. They engineered it, orchestrating scenarios to maximize their observations and ensure that no detail of the body's collapse went undocumented. The villagers who lived in the shadow of the estate carried stories that grew darker with each passing generation. They spoke of figures wandering the woods at night, half-dead souls who had somehow escaped the chambers only to die of their wounds before reaching help. These sightings became rare, but they fed the belief that the Dunleiths' captives were never meant to leave alive. Farmers told of finding bodies buried shallow in the earth, marked with scars and strange mutilations that bore no resemblance to ordinary violence. Some said that animals went missing too, taken from fields and forests to serve as preliminary tests before the human experiments began. In every case, the conclusion was the same. The estate consumed life without remorse, leaving nothing behind but whispers and unease. The meticulous record-keeping of the family further underscored the systematic nature of their cruelty. Journals were filled with observations that treated human lives as though they were mere specimens, reducing agony to a detached series of numbers and outcomes. One entry might describe the precise number of hours a subject remained conscious under starvation, while another would catalogue the exact moment of organ failure after exposure to toxins. These records were passed down like sacred texts, guiding the next generation of Dunleiths in continuing the work. The humanity of their subjects was stripped away entirely. They were not remembered as people, but as experiments with reference codes, dates, and notes on how effectively their bodies yielded to torment. The sheer scale of these practices revealed a chilling truth. The Dunleiths had no interest in saving lives or advancing medicine in a way that would benefit humanity. Their obsession was not rooted in the desire to cure, but in the thrill of control, the intoxicating power of dictating life and death at will. Every disappearance, every captive, every scream in the darkness served the same purpose: to feed the family's insatiable appetite for knowledge twisted into cruelty. Those taken into the estate's depths were never meant to walk free again. their fate sealed from the moment they crossed the threshold into a house where science had become synonymous with suffering. The legacy of the Dunleith family was not one of wealth or prestige, as the outside world might have believed, but of madness carefully preserved and cultivated like a poisonous seed passed from one generation to the next. Within the family, there was an unspoken understanding that the estate itself was not simply a home, but a vessel for their work, and that work was never to end. Children of the bloodline were raised not with fairy tales and gentle instruction, but with the cold weight of expectation, shown early on that the true inheritance of their lineage lay in the chambers beneath their feet. From the moment they could read, they were exposed to the journals of their ancestors, thick tomes bound in leather and stained with ink that chronicled the experiments carried out over centuries. The children were expected to learn not only history, but the methods of dissection, the language of alchemy, and the calculations of endurance. This was their schooling, an education built upon the broken bodies of countless victims, and it was drilled into them as a responsibility they were forbidden to abandon. The heirs of the Dunleiths were often introduced to the experiments gradually, at first made to observe from the shadows as subjects writhed under the hands of their elders. They were instructed to take notes, to measure breathing, to calculate pulse and temperature while ignoring the cries that filled the air. Empathy was not only discouraged, but punished, dismissed as weakness unworthy of their bloodline. Over time, these children grew accustomed to the suffering before them, their eyes hardening, their pens steadying, until they no longer saw people but instruments of data. Eventually, they would be asked to make their first incision, to administer a mixture, or to restrain a captive. Each step was a rite of passage, a grim initiation into a legacy that chained them to the family's obsessions. By the time they reached adulthood, resistance was nearly impossible, for the Dunleith identity was inseparable from the horrors carried out in their name. It was not uncommon for members of the family to fracture under the weight of this inheritance, but even madness was absorbed into their practices. Some heirs withdrew completely, muttering to themselves in the upper halls, while others became violent in their zeal, conducting experiments with reckless cruelty that even their relatives found unsettling. Yet rather than being cast out, these broken minds were preserved within the estate, their ramblings recorded, their brutal methods sometimes adopted and refined by others. Insanity became part of the family law, treated as both consequence and resource, another form of knowledge to be studied and passed on. In this way, the Dunleiths not only perpetuated their legacy, but deepened it, layering madness upon madness until it became indistinguishable from tradition. The journals of the family reveal how this legacy was ritualized. Each generation added to the collection, ensuring that no detail of their work was lost. The writings were not kept in libraries accessible to outsiders, but locked away in hidden rooms, illuminated by candlelight when the heirs gathered to study them. Margins were filled with notes, calculations, and corrections, as though the suffering of the previous century was merely groundwork for the discoveries of the next. There was a reverence in the way they treated these documents, handling them with a kind of sacred care that suggested they believed their ancestors were guiding them from beyond the grave. To the Dunleiths, these journals were scripture, proof that their calling was not madness but destiny, that their bloodline had been chosen to carry out work too terrible for ordinary minds to comprehend. The family's reputation in the outside world was carefully managed to conceal this legacy of insanity. To their peers, the Dunleiths were known as reclusive intellectuals, eccentric but respected for their academic achievements. They attended lectures, published modest works on harmless scientific topics, and donated occasionally to universities to maintain appearances. But behind closed doors, the true face of the family was revealed in the training of the next generation, in the rituals of observation, and in the constant pursuit of experiments that no one outside their walls would ever condone. The veneer of civility was merely a shield, protecting a lineage that had bound itself to the perpetuation of cruelty. There were whispers, even within the family, that the estate itself played a role in their descent into madness. Some claimed that the walls of the chambers seemed to remember every scream, that the air grew heavier with each death, pressing down on the minds of those who lingered there too long. Others spoke of visions seen in the flickering lamplight, shapes moving just beyond sight, as though the suffering of centuries had conjured something alive in the darkness. Whether these were hallucinations brought on by guilt and fear or something far more sinister, they only deepened the family's conviction that their work was guided by forces greater than themselves. To abandon the legacy would have meant betraying not only their ancestors, but whatever unseen presence they believed watched over their estate. The most tragic element of this legacy was the way it consumed individuality. A Dunleith heir was never permitted to define themselves outside of the family's pursuits. Any inclination toward kindness, creativity, or ordinary life was swiftly crushed beneath the expectation of continuing the experiments. Marriage was often arranged not for affection, but to preserve the bloodline, and children were raised as instruments rather than individuals. In some cases, those who resisted were themselves subjected to experimentation, their bodies sacrificed to the cause as a final lesson to others who might dream of escape. The cycle was brutal and unrelenting, ensuring that the family remained trapped within its own history, unable to imagine a future beyond the horrors they had inherited. Through generations, the Dunleith family became less a collection of individuals and more a single, unbroken thread of obsession. Each heir was molded in the likeness of those who came before, their lives consumed by journals, rituals, and the ceaseless repetition of cruelty disguised as progress. Their legacy was not measured in wealth, property, or influence, but in the number of subjects who perished beneath their hands, in the pages of notes filled with observations of agony, and in the continuation of madness that no generation was permitted to end. The philosophy that guided the Dunleith family's experiments was rooted in a chilling conviction that survival was not the desired outcome, but a flaw in the process. To them, the end of every trial was not meant to yield a living subject, but a body that revealed the secrets they sought to uncover. They believed that death itself was the final page of every experiment, the point at which the body surrendered its mysteries in ways the living could never provide. This ideology made their work fundamentally destructive, stripping away any pretense of progress or benefit, and replacing it with an obsession for the act of ending life in pursuit of knowledge. To the Dunleiths, survival was evidence of an incomplete experiment, a sign that more pain, more precision, and more intervention were required to reach the truth. Every chamber beneath the estate was designed with this philosophy in mind. The tables upon which subjects were bound were not made for comfort or recovery, but for containment and disposal. Drainage channels carved into the stone floors made it clear that blood was an expected outcome, not an accident. Implements were carefully arranged to ensure that the experiment could proceed to its inevitable conclusion, whether through prolonged agony or immediate death. The family never created systems for healing or recovery because such considerations had no place in their work. From the very first incision to the final breath, the process was engineered to end with silence. The cruelty of this philosophy was amplified by the clinical detachment with which it was carried out. Members of the family treated the dying as little more than instruments, their cries and convulsions reduced to lines in journals or sketches on parchment. Observers were instructed to mark the precise moment when breath ceased, to measure how long a body continued to twitch after the heart stopped, to record the temperature of the flesh as it cooled. These details were noted with the same care a physician might reserve for monitoring a patient's recovery, but here they documented only the stages of inevitable decline. The lack of empathy was not accidental, but cultivated, taught to each generation as a necessary discipline. To see the subjects as human would have been to admit to cruelty, and cruelty was not how the Dunleiths described their work. To them, it was discovery, and discovery demanded death. No one who entered the estate as a subject was ever intended to leave alive. This truth created an atmosphere of absolute finality around the family's practices. Captives might cling to hope, believing they could endure long enough to be released, but that hope was systematically stripped away. Each test was designed to push the limits of the body until the body could endure no more. Whether through starvation, exposure to toxins, surgical alteration, or mechanical devices of restraint and suffocation, every subject was guided toward an end predetermined before the first step of the process began. Death was not an accident within the Dunleith estate. It was the destination, carefully charted and meticulously documented. The philosophy also fed into the family's sense of superiority. They believed themselves elevated above ordinary morality, chosen to carry out work that no one else dared to attempt. By rejecting the concept of survival as a goal, they convinced themselves that they were not constrained by the same limitations as conventional science. They saw other physicians and scholars as naive, wasting their efforts on preserving life when true understanding could only be found in studying its cessation. This arrogance insulated them from doubt, creating a cycle in which every act of destruction was not only justified, but celebrated within the confines of their lineage. The villagers who lived in the shadow of the estate came to understand this truth in their own way. They knew that anyone taken behind the Dunleith walls was never seen again, that survival was not part of the family's purpose. Parents warned their children to stay away from the estate. Travelers hurried past its roads, and priests whispered that those who entered its halls had already been claimed by death. The land itself seemed to embody this inevitability, with stories of unnatural silence falling over the woods and birds refusing to nest near the mansion. To the outside world, the Dunleith estate became a place where life had no meaning, where entry meant surrender to a fate that could not be reversed. Even within the family's writings, the language revealed how deeply this philosophy was ingrained. Notes described death not as an unfortunate consequence, but as the desired point of arrival. Phrases such as "subject concluded" or "experiment resolved" were used in place of the word death, as though language itself could strip away the horror of what had been done. The journals did not speak of suffering or loss, only of outcomes, measurements, and observations that made each death appear sterile, purposeful, and almost mechanical. Yet beneath this clinical language lay the chilling reality that the family had abandoned the idea of preserving life entirely, embracing destruction as their sole pursuit. What made this ideology all the more terrifying was its permanence. Unlike other experimenters who might have justified cruelty as a temporary means to an end, the Dunleiths did not believe their work could ever truly conclude. Because survival was always a failure in their eyes, there was no final achievement, no moment where they could declare their pursuit complete. Each death only confirmed the need for the next, creating an endless cycle where the family was locked into perpetual experimentation. They were not searching for a cure, an invention, or a revelation that could one day release them from their work. Their philosophy guaranteed that they would never stop, because the outcome they sought could only ever be found in repetition and ruin. This worldview spread through every aspect of the family's existence, shaping their relationships, their legacy, and their sense of identity. To be a Dunleith was to embrace the inevitability of death as the foundation of knowledge, to accept that survival had no place in their experiments, and to carry forward a tradition that consumed lives without remorse. It was not a flaw of individual members, but a creed etched into their very bloodline, ensuring that every heir understood the family's grim purpose and carried it out with unwavering devotion. The philosophy that no one was meant to survive became the chain that bound the family together, generation after generation, until it defined them more completely than their name, their estate, or even their humanity.